Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the English Globe. We're so glad to have you with us today. If you're new to our podcast, thank you for tuning in. My name is Adam, and I'm here with my co-host, Julia.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here as always. We're so excited to dive into today's topic, and I think this one is going to be really special. We're going to talk about something that every English learner dreams of achieving: fluency in English.
That's right, Julia. Fluency is often the goal for many people who are learning English. But what does fluency actually mean? And how can we get there faster? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today.
Yes, fluency in English is not just about knowing a lot of words or being able to speak quickly. It's about being able to communicate smoothly and confidently in everyday situations. And the secret is that fluency is much more than what most people think it is. So we're going to reveal a key element of fluency that many learners miss out on.
Exactly. So today's episode is all about the secret to fluent English that everyone misses. We're going to talk about what fluency truly means, why it's so important, and, most importantly, we're going to share the one thing that can make a huge difference in your language learning journey. It's not just about learning vocabulary or grammar rules. There's a deeper element that, when you understand it and practice it, can take your English to the next level.
Right. This element is often overlooked by many learners, but it's something we believe makes a huge impact. And we're going to break it down for you in a simple and clear way. You'll also hear about how this secret ingredient is something you can start working on right now. So no matter where you are in your learning process, this episode is for you.
Before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about why fluency is so important. Fluency helps you feel more confident when speaking or writing in English. It opens doors to new opportunities, whether it's for travel, work, or just making new friends from all over the world. When you're fluent, you can express yourself clearly and understand others better, which makes communication much easier and more enjoyable.
Exactly. Fluency is not just about speaking fast. It's about speaking naturally. The goal is to be able to use English in your day-to-day life without constantly thinking about grammar or searching for the right word. It's when speaking feels like second nature, and you can focus on the message, not on the mechanics of the language.
And here's something interesting. Fluency doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey that takes time and practice, but there's something that can accelerate that journey. That's what we're going to talk about today. We'll give you practical advice, real-world examples, and tips that you can apply right away.
Throughout this episode, we'll break down the steps, share some stories, and answer common questions. We'll show you how to get past the roadblocks that can slow you down. And by the end of this episode, we want you to feel inspired and ready to take action. Because once you understand this secret, you'll have a clearer path to fluent English.
So get comfortable, grab a notebook if you like to take notes, and let's dive into the secret to fluent English that everyone misses. It's time to unlock your potential and learn how to speak English with confidence.
Let's get started.
All right. Now that we've introduced the topic, let's start by diving into what fluency actually means. Now, many learners might think that fluency in English is just about knowing a lot of words or being able to speak quickly. While it's true that vocabulary is important, fluency goes far beyond that simple definition. Fluency is not just about speaking fast or knowing many words. It's about being able to use the language naturally and comfortably in real-life situations. It's the ability to express your thoughts clearly and confidently, without constantly stopping to search for words or worrying about grammar.
Exactly, Adam. And the reason people get confused is because we often associate fluency with speaking only. But true fluency includes much more than just speaking. It includes speaking, listening, reading, and writing skills, all working together in harmony. You might be a great speaker, but if you struggle with understanding what others are saying, or if you can't read and understand English texts well, then your fluency isn't fully developed. The same goes for writing. You can speak fluently, but if you have difficulty writing your ideas clearly, you won't be able to communicate effectively in all situations. Fluency is about balance in all these skills.
Exactly. So, let's break it down a bit. When we talk about speaking fluently, we're talking about being able to speak with confidence, to put your thoughts into words easily, and to engage in a conversation without constantly pausing or searching for words. It's not about speed, it's about ease and comfort. Imagine you're having a casual conversation with a friend in English. You don't need to stop and think every time you want to say something. You can just speak naturally, without hesitation, using the right words and phrases.
Right. And when it comes to listening fluency, it's similar. It's about understanding what people are saying to you, not just catching a few words here and there. A fluent listener can understand different accents, various speeds of speech, and can follow along with conversations in different contexts, whether it's in a formal meeting or a casual chat at a coffee shop. For example, think about watching a movie or listening to a podcast in English. If you're fluent, you can understand most of the conversation, even when people speak quickly or use slang. You don't need to constantly pause and rewind because you're able to catch the meaning the first time.
Yes, that's a great point. Now let's move on to reading fluency. Being a fluent reader means that you can read English texts, whether they're books, articles, or even social media posts, and understand the meaning without having to look up every word. Fluency in reading is not about reading fast. It's about being able to understand the message and context of what you're reading. For instance, if you pick up a newspaper article in English, a fluent reader can skim through it, picking out the main ideas and details without having to stop at every unfamiliar word. They can focus on the overall meaning of the text rather than getting stuck on individual words.
That's right. And then there's writing fluency. Fluent writers can express their ideas clearly and coherently on paper, whether they're writing an email, an essay, or even a simple text message. Writing fluently doesn't just mean using correct grammar and vocabulary. It also means organizing your thoughts logically and presenting them in a way that others can easily understand. Imagine you're writing a letter to a friend. If you're fluent, you won't have to stop and think about how to organize your sentences or whether the grammar is correct. You'll just write your message naturally, knowing that the person reading it will understand your meaning right away.
Exactly, Julia. So, fluency involves the ability to connect these skills together. It's not just about mastering one skill in isolation. It's about being able to use them together to communicate effectively in the real world. If you're only focused on speaking, you may find yourself in situations where you understand what people are saying but can't respond. Or, you may be able to write well but struggle when someone speaks to you in English. Fluency means developing all four skills in a way that complements each other, each.
To really understand fluency, let's look at some practical examples. For instance, imagine you're in a job interview in English. You need to be able to speak clearly and confidently, but you also need to listen carefully to the interviewer's questions. At the same time, you might need to read some materials before the interview or take notes during the conversation. After the interview, you may need to write a thank you email to the interviewer. All of these skills, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, come together to help you succeed in the interview. If you lack fluency in any of these areas, it could affect your performance.
Great example, Julia. Another example could be traveling to an English-speaking country. Fluency would help you navigate different situations, like asking for directions, ordering food at a restaurant, reading street signs, and even texting or emailing a friend for help. Imagine going to a cafe and being able to order your coffee without hesitation, understanding the menu, having a natural conversation with the barista, and then reading the city's map to find your way around. All of this without getting lost or frustrated. That's the power of fluency.
And let's not forget that fluency is a continuous process. It's not something you finish, it's something you develop over time. Even native speakers continue to improve their language skills throughout their lives. Fluency is something that you keep building, step by step, and the more you practice, the more comfortable you become in using all the language skills, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, in real-world situations. It's about comfort, not perfection. As you practice, you'll become more confident in your abilities, and that's what really matters.
Absolutely. So, to summarize this segment, fluency in English means having the ability to use speaking, listening, reading, and writing skills naturally and effectively. It's not just about knowing words or speaking quickly. It's about the ability to communicate easily in a variety of situations. When you develop fluency, you're able to understand others, express yourself clearly, and feel confident in using English no matter where you are.
And remember, fluency is a journey. It's something you build over time by practicing all these skills together. The more you work on them, the more fluent you will become. In the next segment, we'll talk about the secret ingredient to achieving fluency faster and more effectively.
All right, let's get into the heart of today's episode. You've already learned that fluency is about more than just vocabulary or speaking quickly. It's about mastering all 4 key language skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing, in a way that helps you communicate naturally and confidently. But here's the big question. What is the secret ingredient that can accelerate your journey to fluency? What's the one thing that many learners miss, but is actually essential for truly understanding and speaking English fluently?
That's a great question, Adam. And I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by the answer. So here it is. The secret ingredient for fluency is context. Context is everything when it comes to learning English. It's the key that unlocks your ability to understand, use, and retain the language in real-life situations. In simple terms, it's about understanding how and why we use certain words, phrases, and grammar in different situations. It's about learning the nuances of the language, the little things that make all the difference when speaking naturally.
Yes, exactly. So many learners focus solely on memorizing lists of words or grammar rules, but they forget that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. Words and grammar aren't useful unless we understand how to use them in the right context. For example, think about how different English can sound depending on the situation. The way you speak to a close friend is very different from the way you would speak to your boss, right? Even though the words might be the same, the tone, the formality, and the structure of the sentences can change completely, depending on the context.
That's such a great point, Adam. Let's break this down a little further. Think about the phrase, "How are you?" In an English lesson, it might seem like just a simple greeting, but depending on the context, "How are you?" could be used in many different ways. You could say it to someone you know well, with a friendly and casual tone. But if you're in a formal business meeting, you might ask, "How are you today?" with a slightly different tone and maybe a follow-up question like, "I hope everything is going well with your work." The words are almost the same, but the tone and context change the meaning completely.
Right. And that's why focusing on context is so important. It's not just about knowing words in isolation, it's about understanding how words fit into real-life situations. You can know all the vocabulary in the world, but if you don't know how to use it in the right context, you'll sound unnatural. For example, if you learn the word cheers and think it only means thank you or goodbye, you might miss its full range of uses. In Britain, cheers can be used as a casual way to say thank you, but it can also be used when offering a toast. In different places, you might hear cheers used in different ways, depending on the context of the conversation.
Exactly, Adam. And another great example comes from understanding the formality of different situations. Let's take a look at the difference between formal and informal greetings. In an informal situation, you might say, "Hey, what's up?" to a friend, but in a formal setting, such as a job interview, you would say, "Good morning, how are you today?" The difference is not just in the words, it's in how you say them and who you're speaking to. Understanding these small differences is a huge part of fluency. If you can't adjust to the context, you'll miss the mark, and your language will sound awkward or out of place.
That's right. And one of the most important aspects of context is understanding culture. Language is deeply connected to culture, and the way people speak in English-speaking countries is shaped by cultural norms and values. For instance, in the US, people tend to be very direct in their communication, whereas in the UK, people are often more indirect and polite. If you don't understand these cultural differences, you might misunderstand the meaning behind certain phrases or come across as rude without intending to. For example, in the US, if you say "I'll get back to you later," it's generally understood to mean "I'll follow up with you soon." But in the UK, it might be taken as "I'm not really interested in following up with you." These cultural subtleties can change the entire meaning of a sentence.
Great example. And you might be thinking, how do I learn all of this context? How do I know when to use certain words or phrases? Well, the key is to immerse yourself in real English conversations as much as possible. Listening to native speakers in different settings, whether it's through movies, TV shows, podcasts, or even just chatting with people in English, helps you pick up on these cultural nuances and learn how context shapes communication.
Absolutely. Immersing yourself in authentic English conversations is one of the best ways to understand context. And it doesn't just stop with speaking and listening. When you read books, articles, or blogs, you're also learning about how different contexts shape language. For example, a novel might have characters who speak very casually and use slang, while a formal academic article will use more technical language and formal structures. As you expose yourself to different types of content, you'll start to recognize patterns in how language is used in different contexts.
Yes. And one of the best ways to practice understanding context is to put yourself in real-world situations where you have to use English. It's one thing to study English in the classroom, but it's another thing to use it in daily life. So, think about joining an English-speaking club or group, participating in language exchanges, or even just starting casual conversations with native speakers. When you use English in context, whether you're ordering food at a restaurant, making small talk with a colleague, or even asking for directions, you'll start to see how the language works in those situations. And the more you practice, the more natural it will feel.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Context is something you learn by doing. It's okay if you say something that sounds a little strange. It's all part of the learning process. The more you practice, the more comfortable and confident you'll become with switching between different contexts and adjusting your language accordingly.
And Adam, one thing I love about context is that it makes language learning so much more practical. When you focus on context, you're not just learning words, you're learning how to use the language in real, everyday situations. You're preparing yourself for real-life conversations, and that's what makes fluency so achievable.
Exactly. So let's recap. The secret ingredient for fluency is context. Understanding the context in which words and phrases are used is what helps you sound natural and fluent in English. It's not just about knowing a list of vocabulary. It's about knowing when and how to use those words in different situations. The more you immerse yourself in English, practice real conversations, and pay attention to the cultural and situational factors, the more fluent you'll become.
And remember, fluency is not just about perfect grammar or memorizing words. It's about the flow of conversation, the ability to adapt to different situations, and the confidence to communicate in real-world contexts. So, the next time you find yourself in a conversation or listening to English, pay attention to the context, what's being said, how it's being said, and why. This will take your fluency to the next level.
Absolutely, Julia. And I'm excited because in our next segment, we'll talk about some specific ways to practice and improve your understanding of context, as well as some tips for applying this secret ingredient to your language learning routine. All right, we've covered the importance of context and how it's the secret ingredient that makes a world of difference when it comes to fluency. Now let's dive into some real-life scenarios where this concept plays a huge role. We want to show you exactly how context works in practice and give you practical tips that you can apply right away to improve your English skills. These examples will help you understand how context isn't just a theory, but something that will immediately make your language learning experience richer, more effective, and more natural.
Yes, absolutely. And remember, context isn't just about what words mean. It's about how they fit together and how they change based on the situation you're in. So, let's start with a very common situation: meeting someone new. Think about the first time you meet someone in English. If you're at a job interview, you might say, "It's a pleasure to meet you." You'd be polite and formal, right? But if you meet someone at a party or with friends, you're more likely to say, "Hey, nice to meet you." Or simply, "Hi, I'm Julia." The words are simple, but the tone, level of formality, and even body language make a huge difference.
Right, Julia. And this is exactly what we mean by context. Both situations use similar words, but how you say them, when you say them, and who you say them to changes everything. So how can learners apply this concept of context to their everyday practice? Well, one easy way is to actively think about the situation you're in before you speak. Are you talking to a friend? Are you in a meeting? Are you at a store? All of these situations require different types of language, and once you start thinking about context, it will help you make better decisions about what words to use and how to phrase your sentences.
Exactly, Adam. Let's look at another example. Asking for help. Imagine you're in a store and you need assistance. If you're in a casual setting, like a small boutique or a local shop, you might say, "Hey, can you help me out with this?" It's friendly and informal. But if you're in a more formal setting, like a high-end department store, you might say, "Excuse me, could you please assist me with something?" The difference here isn't just in the words, it's in the level of politeness and formality. And this is something learners can start practicing right now. Think about where you are and who you're talking to, and adjust your language accordingly.
That's right. And another great real-world example is when you're ordering food at a restaurant. If you're at a fast food restaurant, you might say, "I'll have a burger, please." It's quick and direct. But if you're at a fine dining restaurant, you would probably use a more formal tone and say, "Could I please have the grilled chicken with vegetables?" The way you phrase things changes because of the situation, and understanding how to adapt your language to these different contexts is what will make you sound more fluent. So, how can learners practice this? One simple method is to put yourself in different imagined scenarios. Pretend you're at a restaurant, a job interview, or a casual gathering with friends. Try to change your language based on the context of each situation.
I love that suggestion, Adam. Imagining different scenarios is a fantastic way to practice. Another scenario I want to share is making a complaint. Let's say you're at a hotel and there's a problem with your room. If you're dealing with a customer service representative, you'll want to use polite, formal language. You might say, "Excuse me, I'm afraid there's a problem with my room. The air conditioning isn't working properly, and I would appreciate it if you could help me resolve this issue." In contrast, if you're complaining about something to a friend, you might say, "Ugh, my room is so hot. The AC is broken again." Both sentences are complaints, but one is much more formal and the other is casual. Understanding how to navigate these shifts in language based on the situation will make a big difference in your fluency.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that context isn't only about formality. It's also about the situation itself. For example, let's say you're at a party. If you want to start a conversation with someone you don't know very well, you might say something like, "Hey, what do you think of the party?" It's a simple, friendly way to break the ice. But if you're in a more professional setting, like a business conference, you might ask, "What do you do for work?" Or, "How did you get started in your field?" Even though you're talking to people, the type of conversation changes based on the context. This is another way you can practice context in real life, by paying attention to the type of conversation you're having and adapting your language to fit.
That's such a great point, Adam. And one thing that's key here is that context is learned through experience. The more you put yourself in different situations, whether it's through conversations, watching TV shows, or reading about different cultural practices, the better you'll get at adapting your language. So, Let's give our listeners a few practical tips they can start using right away to practice this idea of context. First, one of the easiest ways to get better at understanding context is to listen actively. When you listen to native speakers, pay attention to how they adjust their tone and words depending on the situation. You can even watch TV shows or movies and take notes on how characters change their language in different settings.
Great idea. Another tip is to practice role-playing scenarios with a friend, a teacher, or even by yourself. For example, pretend you're ordering coffee at a cafe, or imagine you're introducing yourself at a job interview. Try to adjust your language based on the situation. You can even practice using different levels of formality in everyday situations. For example, try saying the same thing 3 different ways, once casually, once formally, and once politely. This helps you become more comfortable switching between different types of language based on the context.
That's a fantastic tip, Adam. And I think one of the most helpful things learners can do is simply observe and mimic. Watch how native speakers interact with each other, whether it's in movies, YouTube videos, or in real life, and try to mimic the way they adapt their language to the situation. Pay attention to small details, like how they start or end a conversation, the level of formality, and how they express politeness. This is a simple way to start building your understanding of context without even realizing it.
Exactly. And if you're not sure how to express something in a specific context, don't be afraid to ask someone. Native speakers are usually happy to explain when something sounds too casual or too formal. This helps you refine your language skills and understand the nuances of context even more.
One last piece of advice I want to add is to focus on empathy when you're learning context. Try to think about the other person's perspective. How might they be feeling? What's their cultural background? What kind of relationship do you have with them? This will help you naturally adjust your language in a way that fits the context of the conversation.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Julia. Empathy is key. Understanding not just the words but the feelings behind them will make you a more confident and fluent speaker. So, to wrap up this segment, context is the secret ingredient to fluency. It's not just about knowing words or grammar. It's about understanding when and how to use language in different situations. By practicing real-life scenarios, observing native speakers, and mimicking different contexts, you'll improve your fluency faster than you might think.
And remember, language is alive. It changes with the context, and the more you expose yourself to it in real-life situations, the better you'll get at using it naturally. So get out there, practice in real situations, and let context be your guide.
And stay tuned, because in the next segment, we'll share some powerful exercises to help you continue applying the secret ingredient of context in your English learning journey. All right, we've talked a lot about the secret ingredient to fluency, which is context, and how it plays a critical role in your ability to speak English naturally. Now, it's time to get into the practical side of things. How can you actually practice and apply this secret ingredient in your own language learning journey? We're going to dive into some powerful tips, techniques, and strategies that will help you incorporate context into your learning. These methods are designed to boost your fluency over time, making your English sound more natural and authentic. So, let's jump right in.
Yes, Adam. The first thing we want to emphasize is the importance of active listening. You see, fluency is not just about speaking. It's equally about listening and understanding how native speakers use language in different situations. The more you listen actively, the better you'll understand how context influences language use. So, how can you practice this? One great strategy is to listen to podcasts, TV shows, movies, or YouTube videos in English, especially content that features real, everyday conversations. The key here is to pay attention to the context in which the language is used. For example, listen to how people talk to their friends, how they talk in professional settings, or how they speak in formal situations. Pay attention to things like tone, word choice, and how formal or informal the conversation is. Ask yourself, what makes this conversation sound natural in this context? How does the language change when the setting changes?
That's right, Julia. And to take it a step further, you can start mimicking what you hear. This technique is called shadowing. Shadowing is when you repeat what a speaker says, trying to match their tone, pace, and intonation. The key is to focus not just on the words, but also on how the words are said. For example, if you're watching a TV show and hear someone say, "Could you please pass the salt?" in a polite, formal way, you should repeat that exact sentence, but pay attention to how the speaker uses intonation. Do they stress certain words? Do they speak slowly or quickly? By mimicking this speech pattern, you're practicing how to use English more naturally in the right context. And the best part is, this doesn't just apply to TV shows or movies. You can do it with any type of listening material, whether it's a TED Talk, a YouTube video, or even an audiobook. By shadowing, you'll be able to naturally absorb the language and begin using it just as fluently and contextually as the speakers you're listening to.
I love that, Adam. Shadowing is such an effective way to improve not just your pronunciation, but also your understanding of context. Now, let's talk about another powerful strategy: role-playing different scenarios. As we discussed earlier, context is all about how the situation influences the language you use. And one of the best ways to practice adapting to different contexts is by acting out various real-life situations. You can create role-play exercises for yourself or with a study partner. For example, practice introducing yourself at a job interview, ordering food at a restaurant, or making small talk at a party. The idea is to simulate real-life situations where you'll need to adjust your language based on the context. This can help you internalize the different ways you need to speak in different settings. And the great thing about role-playing is that you can create scenarios for any situation you might encounter. If you're not sure how to handle a specific situation, you can practice with a language partner or even record yourself acting out different scenarios. This way, you get a feel for how to use language fluently in multiple contexts.
That's a fantastic strategy, Julia. Another technique that's great for practicing context is reading with awareness. You've probably heard this advice before, but when it comes to fluency, reading becomes more than just understanding the words. It's about understanding the context behind them. So as you read, try to think about the context of the text. What kind of situation is the conversation happening in? What is the relationship between the speaker and the listener? Is it formal, casual, or neutral? Is the speaker trying to convince someone or just make small talk? For example, if you're reading a business email, focus on the formality of the language. How do phrases like, "I would appreciate it," or "Thank you for your consideration," signal formality? On the other hand, if you're reading a novel or watching a TV show, notice how characters use informal language and contractions. Do they use slang? Do they speak in short sentences or elaborate ones? Paying attention to the context of what you're reading will help you understand how words and phrases function in different settings. This will help you use them naturally in your own speech.
That's such a great point, Adam. And reading can be particularly useful if you're trying to learn about specific situations where context is crucial. For example, reading news articles or blogs can expose you to language used in professional and formal settings, while reading fiction or watching sitcoms can give you examples of everyday, informal conversations. The more varied the reading materials, the better you can practice switching between different contexts and learning which language works best in each. Now, let's move on to another key strategy that is often overlooked: asking for feedback. One of the best ways to improve your fluency is by getting feedback from native speakers or language teachers. This is especially useful when you're trying to figure out if your use of language fits the context. For instance, you might say something in an overly formal way when you meant to be casual, or you might use casual language in a formal business setting without realizing it. Getting feedback helps you spot these mistakes and improve faster. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. You can do this in language exchange groups, online communities, or even during language classes. Ask questions like, Does this sound natural in this situation? Or, is this the best way to phrase it in this context? A native speaker will often give you tips on how to sound more fluent and appropriate in different contexts.
Exactly, Julia. And while we're talking about feedback, another helpful tool is self-assessment. You can assess how well you're adapting to different contexts by recording yourself speaking. After a conversation, listen to it and ask yourself, did I use the right level of formality? Was I too casual or too formal? Did my tone match the situation? If you're unsure, try recording the same conversation with a slightly different tone or word choice. Listen to both versions and compare. This kind of self-reflection helps you fine-tune your language and become more aware of your own fluency.
Self-assessment is an excellent way to track your progress and ensure that you're practicing in the right way. And the more you practice, the more you'll internalize how context works in real-life situations. But don't forget that exposure is another key to mastering context. The more you expose yourself to different types of English, whether it's through conversations, listening, reading, or watching, you'll begin to recognize patterns in how language shifts depending on the context. You might want to try something like a language immersion challenge. Spend a day or a week where you expose yourself only to English in all its forms. Listen to English podcasts, watch English movies, read English books, and try to have conversations in English as much as possible. The goal is to immerse yourself in the language so that you can start noticing how context shapes the language in everyday life. This kind of immersive practice helps you absorb language naturally and adapt it to different situations.
Wow, Julia, those are some excellent ideas. So, to recap, here are some strategies that you can start using today to practice context and improve your fluency. Active listening. Pay attention to how native speakers use language in different contexts and try to mimic what you hear. Role-playing. Practice real-life situations to improve your ability to switch between different language contexts. Reading with awareness. Focus on the context of the language you read, whether it's formal or informal, and apply it to your own speech. Asking for feedback. Don't be afraid to get feedback from native speakers or teachers about your use of language in different situations. Self-assessment. Record yourself speaking and assess how well you're using language in the right context. Exposure. Immerse yourself in the language as much as possible, whether through media or conversation, to naturally absorb contextual language.
And remember, fluency doesn't come overnight. But with consistent practice, patience, and exposure to different contexts, you'll improve over time. The secret ingredient to fluency, context, is something that all learners can work into their practice. So, take these tips, apply them to your daily routine, and watch how your English becomes more natural and confident.
That's right. We hope these tips help you feel more empowered to improve your English fluency. Keep practicing, and don't forget that language learning is a journey, not a race. Keep using context to guide you, and you'll see amazing results.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope this segment has given you the tools and strategies to improve your fluency. Stay tuned for more tips in the upcoming segments.
All right, listeners, we've covered the theory, we've given you the strategies, and now it's time to hear from some real people who have successfully used the secret ingredient, context, to achieve fluency in English. These are stories from learners just like you, people who started out with the same challenges and doubts, but who found a way to overcome them. Their stories are not just motivational, they show you that fluency is attainable, even if it feels out of reach at times. So let's dive into these success stories and see how context helped these individuals unlock their true potential in English.
Yes, Adam. Hearing about others' journeys can be so inspiring. Let's start with the story of Maria, a learner from Spain who struggled with speaking English fluently for many years. She could read and understand English well enough, but when it came to speaking, she would freeze. Maria had been studying English for over 10 years in school, but she never really felt like she was making progress. What she realized was that she had focused too much on memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules. but not enough on the context in which English is used. So Maria decided to make a shift. She started listening to English podcasts that featured conversations between native speakers, talk shows, interviews, casual chats. She paid attention to the tone, the pace of speech, and most importantly, how the speakers adapted their language to the situation. For example, on a talk show, a host might use more formal language when speaking to a celebrity guest, but when the guest was a close friend, the language became much more relaxed and colloquial. Maria began mimicking these conversations, paying close attention to how the words were used in each context. Slowly, she started to realize that understanding context was the missing piece to her fluency puzzle. After a few months of practicing with this new approach, Maria noticed that she felt much more comfortable speaking. She could adjust her language depending on whether she was talking to a friend, a colleague, or a boss. She had found her fluency through understanding the context of each situation and adapting her language accordingly. Maria's story is proof that once you understand the importance of context, your speaking abilities can improve dramatically.
I love that story, Julia. Maria's experience really highlights how focusing on context can bridge the gap between passive understanding and active speaking. Now let's talk about another success story that might resonate with many of you. John, a learner from Brazil who was determined to improve his English to get a better job. John had always been an excellent student in English classes, but he found that his language skills didn't help him much in real-world situations. He knew how to talk about grammar rules and academic subjects, but he couldn't easily communicate in the workplace or during social interactions. One day, John realized that the problem was not his vocabulary or grammar. It was his lack of practice in real-world contexts. He started watching business-related YouTube videos, paying attention to how professionals in his field use language in presentations and meetings. He noticed that when giving a presentation, speakers used more formal, structured language, but in a brainstorming session with colleagues, they were much more relaxed, using a lot of informal phrases, idioms, and slang. This sparked an idea for John. What if he could practice speaking in these different business contexts to feel more comfortable in those situations? So, John began practicing role-playing exercises. He would practice giving presentations in English, using the kind of formal language he saw in professional videos. Then, he would practice more casual conversations with his friends, using less formal expressions and even learning a few common idioms. By doing this, John was able to develop the skill to switch between different registers of language, whether formal or informal, depending on the context of the conversation. Fast forward 6 months, and John had applied for a new job in an international company. During his interview, he was able to confidently switch between formal language when discussing his qualifications and more casual conversational language when talking about his interests and hobbies. He landed the job, and he attributes much of his success to understanding how to use context in language learning. John's story proves that with the right focus on real-world language use, it's possible to reach fluency, even if you're not a beginner anymore.
That's an incredible transformation, Adam. John's story is a great reminder that context is key when it comes to professional settings. Now, let me tell you about Sophie, a young woman from Thailand who had always loved traveling but struggled with communicating in English while abroad. Sophie had taken English classes throughout high school and college, but she found that when she traveled, she had difficulty understanding local accents and adapting her language to the cultural context. She would often feel lost and frustrated in conversations with people from different English-speaking countries. One of Sophie's friends recommended that she focus more on the context in which people spoke English around the world. Sophie realized that when she traveled to the United States, for example, people used very different slang and informal phrases than when she visited the UK or Australia. Sophie began researching regional variations of English and paid attention to how language changed depending on the setting. For instance, she learned that in the UK, people often used polite indirect phrases like, "Would you mind if I?" While in the US, the same request might be phrased more directly, "Can I?" Sophie spent months immersing herself in different types of English by listening to podcasts, watching travel vlogs, and chatting with native speakers from different parts of the world. She paid close attention to how language was influenced by geography and culture. Over time, Sophie's understanding of the different English-speaking cultures grew, and she became more confident in her ability to engage in conversations while traveling. Sophie's success story is a wonderful example of how context isn't just about formal or informal language. It's also about understanding the cultural nuances of language. By recognizing how people in different parts of the world use English, Sophie was able to break down the language barrier and start communicating effectively in various countries.
What an inspiring journey, Julia. Sophie's story shows that understanding cultural context is just as important as understanding social context. Now let's share one more success story that truly emphasizes the power of perseverance. Ravi, a student from India, had been learning English for years, but he always struggled with speaking. He was shy and lacked the confidence to speak in front of others, even though he was very good at reading and writing English. His friends and teachers told him that he knew English well enough, but Ravi felt that his fluency wasn't where it needed to be. One day, Ravi's teacher introduced him to the idea of language immersion and how it could help him improve his speaking skills. Ravi decided to fully immerse himself in English by speaking it every day, even if it was just with himself. He would describe his day in English, think in English, and even talk to himself in the mirror. The most important change Ravi made, however, was how he started practicing using English in real-life contexts. For instance, when Ravi went to the store, he made an effort to speak English with the shopkeeper. He didn't worry about making mistakes, but instead focused on how to communicate effectively in that situation. He practiced giving directions, asking for help, and ordering food in English, all while making sure to adjust his language to the context of each situation. Over time, Ravi noticed that he became much more comfortable speaking English and didn't feel as shy anymore. Ravi's story is an incredible example of how constant practice, especially in real-world situations, can lead to significant improvements in fluency. His breakthrough came when he started practicing context-based speaking in everyday life, and it paid off. He gained the confidence and fluency he had been striving for.
Wow, what amazing stories, Adam. These success stories are powerful reminders that fluency in English isn't about perfection. It's about the consistent application of context in your language learning journey. Whether it's through listening, speaking, reading, or even self-assessment, the key is to understand how language shifts depending on the situation. And as you can see from these real-world examples, once you start using context in your learning, you'll be well on your way to fluency.
That's right. The success stories we shared today show that no matter where you're starting from, using context in your English practice can make all the difference. It's all about adapting to the situation, practicing regularly, and exposing yourself to English in as many real-world contexts as possible. We hope these stories have inspired you to keep going and to use context as your secret weapon in achieving fluency.
Remember, fluency doesn't happen overnight, but with patience and persistence, you'll get there. Keep practicing, stay motivated, and soon enough, you'll be telling your own success story.
We've had a deep dive into what it takes to achieve fluency in English, focusing on understanding context and how it's the secret ingredient that many learners overlook. Now, it's time to hear from you, our listeners. In this segment, we're going to address some of the questions and challenges that you've been facing on your English learning journeys. If you're new to this podcast, or if this is your first time tuning in, just know that this is an interactive Q&A where we answer your questions and discuss some common struggles learners like you might experience. We want to make sure that you leave this episode with a clearer understanding of how to practice, how to keep moving forward, and how to stay motivated. So, Julia, are you ready to get into some of these questions?
Absolutely, Adam. This is one of my favorite parts of the podcast because it's where we get to hear from our listeners directly. Learning a new language isn't easy, and sometimes it helps to hear other people's struggles and solutions. Plus, addressing your questions is a great way for us to clarify some points and make sure you have the right tools to keep making progress. So let's get started. We've got a few questions from listeners, and I'm excited to dive into them.
Let's go with our first question, which comes from Sarah in Canada. Sarah writes, "I've been studying English for years, but I still feel like I'm not fluent. I understand a lot when I read or listen, but I can't seem to speak as confidently as I would like. How can I get better at speaking in real-life situations?" Great question, Sarah. I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to feeling like they understand English, but struggle to speak it fluently. Julia, what do you think?
That's such a common experience, Sarah. A lot of learners feel that way. They can read and understand, but when it comes to speaking, they freeze or struggle to find the right words. The key here is to practice speaking in real-life situations, just like we talked about earlier with the concept of context. Sarah, it sounds like you're doing a great job with reading and listening, but now you need to focus on practicing speaking in those contexts. What I'd recommend is trying to speak English every day, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes. You don't need to have a formal conversation to practice speaking. You can start by describing your day in English, speaking to yourself, or even using a language exchange app where you can chat with a native speaker or another learner.
That's right, Julia. The key here is regular practice and starting small. Don't put too much pressure on yourself to speak perfectly. Instead, focus on communication. If you're making mistakes, that's fine. It's all part of the process. Also, if you feel nervous about speaking in real-life situations, it might help to start by speaking in more comfortable settings. If you have a friend who speaks English, try practicing with them first. Or if you don't know anyone to practice with, try speaking in front of a mirror. The more you practice speaking in a relaxed environment, the more confident you'll become when you're in a real conversation.
Exactly. One other tip is to learn some key phrases that you can use in various situations. For example, if you're at a coffee shop, learn how to order coffee in English. Or if you're meeting someone for the first time, practice introducing yourself in different ways. The more phrases you know and feel comfortable with, the easier it will be to have a conversation in those contexts. Over time, it'll get easier to expand those conversations as you practice more.
Great advice. Sarah, I hope that helps. Remember, confidence comes with practice. The more you speak, the more fluent you'll become. Keep it up, and don't be too hard on yourself. Now let's move on to the next question.
Our next question comes from Ali, who writes, "I've been listening to a lot of podcasts and watching English TV shows to improve my listening skills, but I still find it hard to understand native speakers, especially when they speak fast. What can I do to improve my listening?" That's a great question, Ali, and I'm sure many of you can relate. Listening to native speakers, especially when they speak quickly, can be a challenge. Adam, any tips for Ali?
Absolutely, Julia. First of all, Ali, it's amazing that you're listening to podcasts and watching English shows. That's exactly what you need to be doing. The problem you're facing is something that many learners go through, so you're not alone. The key to improving your listening skills, especially when dealing with fast speech, is to practice listening actively. Instead of just passively listening to podcasts or shows, try to repeat what you hear. Listen to a short clip and then pause it. Try to repeat exactly what the speaker said, paying attention to their tone, rhythm, and pronunciation. This practice will train your ear to better understand natural speech patterns and also help you get used to the pace at which native speakers talk.
I completely agree with you, Adam. Another method is to use subtitles. You can start by watching a show or listening to a podcast with English subtitles to match the spoken words with the text. This will help you make connections between the sounds and the spelling of words. Eventually, you can try watching or listening without subtitles to challenge yourself. And remember, it's perfectly fine to rewind and listen to the same part multiple times. It's not about understanding everything at once. It's about improving bit by bit.
Another great tip, Julia. And let's not forget about the importance of context here as well. If you're listening to a podcast or watching a show, try to pay attention to the situation and what's being discussed. Are they talking about something serious? Is it a casual conversation? Understanding the context will help you predict what kind of words or expressions might come next, making it easier to follow along even if the speaker is talking quickly.
Definitely. Predicting what comes next is a fantastic listening strategy. Ali, I hope these tips help. Just remember, listening is a skill that takes time to develop, but the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. Don't give up.
And here's a quick tip for everyone listening. Try to immerse yourself in English as much as possible, especially through activities you enjoy. If you like cooking, for example, try watching cooking tutorials in English. If you love sports, listen to sports commentary or watch matches with English commentary. The more you surround yourself with English in fun, interesting ways, the better your listening will become.
Great advice, Adam. Now let's move on to our next question, which comes from David, who says, I understand that fluency isn't just about speaking, but I'm struggling to improve my writing. I can write sentences, but I don't feel confident writing longer pieces like essays or emails. What can I do to improve my writing skills? This is a very common question, David, and a lot of learners struggle with writing because it can feel a bit intimidating at first. What do you think, Adam?
Absolutely, Julia. Writing is one of those skills that can feel like a huge hurdle when you're first starting, especially when you're trying to write longer pieces. But the key to improving your writing is to practice regularly and to pay attention to the context in which you're writing. Start by writing short paragraphs about things you enjoy or topics you're passionate about. This will make the process feel less stressful. And don't worry if it's not perfect. Just get your ideas on paper and then refine them later. One great method to improve your writing is to practice writing emails or short essays on a specific topic every week. Focus on clarity and structure, and over time, you'll see progress.
That's right. One tip that really helped me when I was learning a new language was to read a lot before I wrote. The more you read, the more you'll internalize good sentence structures and vocabulary that you can use in your own writing. Try reading news articles, blogs, or even books in English, paying attention to how sentences are constructed. Once you get used to the flow of writing, you can try to replicate it in your own work.
And don't forget about feedback, David. It's so helpful to get feedback from someone who is fluent in English. Whether it's a teacher, a friend, or even an online community, feedback will show you where you can improve and give you the confidence to keep going. It's also important to not be afraid of mistakes. They're part of the learning process.
Exactly, Adam. So, David, try practicing writing little by little, focusing on structure and clarity. And as always, remember to be patient with yourself. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll get.
And that's all the time we have for questions today. We hope we addressed some of the challenges you're facing and gave you some useful tips to continue your English learning journey. Remember, fluency doesn't happen overnight, but with consistent practice, a focus on context, and a lot of patience, you'll get there. We've come to the end of this incredible journey towards discovering the secret to fluent English. Let's take a moment to summarize the key points we've discussed today. First, we defined what fluency in English really means. It's not just about knowing words or grammar. It's about understanding and using the language effectively in different contexts. We also highlighted that fluency involves 4 core skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Mastering all of these skills takes practice, but with consistent effort, you can definitely improve.
That's right. And then, we explored the secret ingredient to fluency: context. Understanding the context in which the language is used is essential to sounding natural and fluent. It's about more than just the words themselves. It's about knowing when and how to use them. We also provided some real-life examples that demonstrated how this secret ingredient plays a big role in everyday communication. From ordering coffee at a cafe to talking about your day, context helps guide your interactions and makes your language use more meaningful and natural.
In the next part of our podcast, we discussed practical tips and strategies that can help you practice and improve your fluency. From speaking to yourself in English every day to listening actively to podcasts and watching TV shows, we emphasized the importance of regular practice. Remember, fluency isn't just about studying, it's about using the language as much as possible in real-life situations.
And of course, we shared some inspiring success stories of people who have used the secret ingredient, context, to improve their fluency. Their stories are proof that with the right mindset and consistent effort, anyone can improve their English skills. And finally, we tackled your questions, offering solutions to common struggles, like speaking with confidence and improving listening skills. It's all about taking small, consistent steps and not being afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly, Julia. So now that you have all these strategies and tips, it's time for you to take action. Start practicing today. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The best time to start is now. Use what we've talked about and integrate it into your daily life. Remember, practice makes progress, not perfection. The more you immerse yourself in English, the more fluent you'll become.
We believe in you, and we're excited to see your progress. Keep using the strategies we've discussed, and don't forget to be patient with yourself. English fluency takes time, but it's totally achievable if you stay committed. So go ahead, start practicing today, and take your language skills to the next level.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the English Globe. We hope this podcast has given you the motivation and tools to improve your English fluency. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, and anyone else who might benefit from learning English. It's always helpful to spread the knowledge.
And if you haven't already, make sure to follow the English Globe on all our platforms for more content. We've got tons of valuable lessons, tips, and inspiring stories that can help you along your language learning journey. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and other social media platforms. Just search for the English Globe.
Also, if you have any feedback or questions, we would love to hear from you. Drop us a message and let us know what topics you want us to cover next. If you're struggling with any specific areas of English, feel free to ask, and we'll be sure to include some advice in future episodes. Your journey to fluency is important to us, and we're here to help in any way we can.
Absolutely. And if you haven't already, make sure to check out our other episodes. There's so much more to learn, and we're excited to continue this journey with you. So, until next time, keep practicing, keep improving, and we'll see you in the next episode of the English Globe.
Take care, everyone, and happy learning.